the Leon Panetta 2023 Lecture Series. The theme this year is The Presidency and a Divided Congress. Can they govern? This lecture discusses democracy versus autocracy. Can the United States unify allies in a dangerous world? Please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's with great pleasure that I welcome all of you back for the second event of the 2023 Leon Panetta Lecture Series, live here at Leon's hometown of Monterey at the beautiful Monterey Conference Center. Tonight, our focus is foreign affairs. As you know, this is a pivotal time for the United States and for democracy itself. The United States has historically assumed the role of defender of democracy. Today, democracy is under attack. Our theme tonight is democracy versus autocracy. Can the U.S. unify allies in a dangerous world? It has now been over a year since Russian troops invaded the independent nation of Ukraine. The U.S. and NATO sent a unified response that Russia would pay a price for such aggression. Tough sanctions were placed on the Russian economy. Critical weapons and training were provided to train Ukrainian fighters. NATO has been reinforced and strengthened. The Russian invasion was stopped. This is a pivotal war that will not only determine the future of democracy in Ukraine, it will determine the future of democracy in the 21st century. The message we send to Putin is the same message we must send to Xi in China, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and the Supreme Leader in Iran. How can the United States protect and defend democracies that are challenged by autocrats in a dangerous world? Can we build strong alliances in the world? Will the U.S. remain the strongest military power on earth? Leon will pose these questions to three experts who, just like him, know these challenges from the front lines. Our first guest has served 8 U.S. presidents and influenced decades of U.S. intelligence and defense policies. He's recognized as a consummate leader and dedicated patriot, and is the only Secretary of Defense to work for both Republicans and Democratic administrations. He began his career at the CIA and spent nearly 27 years as an intelligence professional. He served as director of the CIA through the collapse of the Soviet Union and restructured the intelligence community for a post-Cold War world. He next served as president of Texas A&M University, one of the nation's largest universities, from 2002 to 2006. As Secretary of Defense, he reversed losing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan while preparing the U.S. military for unconventional warfare and for dramatic reductions in federal spending. President Barack Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor. So please welcome Secretary Bob Gates. Our second guest is a highly decorated 4-star general whose distinguished military career spanned more than 37 years that culminated in 6 straight commands, 5 of which were in combat. He is widely credited with changing the course of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He dramatically reduced the violence in Iraq when he led the so-called surge and halted the Taliban's momentum in Afghanistan, where he led the operation. He has been described as one of the great battle captains of American history. Following his military service, he led the CIA, where he oversaw significant achievements in America's global counterterrorism campaign, pursued a substantial initiative to increase worldwide intelligence coverage, guided the development of a strategic plan for the agency, and oversaw the establishment of a new economic security center. Please welcome General David Petraeus. Our third guest is the longest-serving global combatant commander in recent American history, American military history, and is widely recognized for his experience, his expertise, his strategy, tactics, diplomacy, national security, and strategic communications. He has played an influential role in virtually every operation in recent military history, from the United States mission in Afghanistan to protecting Turkish citizens near the border of Syria from ballistic missile attacks, in NATO operations in Libya, and spearheading cybersecurity initiatives. He served as commander of U.S. Southern Command with responsibility for all military operations in Latin America from 2006 to 2009. And in 2013, he completed 4 years as Supreme Allied Commander, NATO, with responsibility for Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, Syria, counter-piracy, and cybersecurity. Please welcome Admiral James Stavridis. And finally, moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He had the honor of working with each of our guests in protecting our national security. Please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, our second forum of the Panetta Lecture Series. The overall theme is the presidency in a divided Congress. Can they govern? But the issue tonight is whether the president and the Congress can work together when it comes to protecting our national security. We live in a dangerous world. More flashpoints than we've seen since World War II. We have a war in Europe, the first since World War II, because Putin brutally invaded a sovereign democracy for no other reason than that he did not believe the people there should decide what kind of government they want to live under. And the U.S. and our NATO allies are unified in support of Ukraine, whose brave fighters were able to stop the Russian invasion. But now what? And how will it end? Xi of China is threatening to invade another democracy in Taiwan and says that China will replace the U.S. as a world leader. Are we in danger of a potential conflict with China as well? Kim Jong-un of North Korea is expanding his nuclear stockpile and improving his missile delivery systems. The supreme leader of Iran now has enough enriched uranium to build a nuclear weapon in the Middle East. Terrorism is alive and well, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to North Africa. And cyber and artificial intelligence could be the new battlefields for the future. With all of these challenges, how do we protect our national security? How do we build the new alliances that we will need in order to help us? Can we remain the strongest military power on the face of the earth? Tough questions. Questions for three of our nation's great national security leaders. Let me begin with what is in the news right now, which is the leak of classified Pentagon documents. We have here 3 former CIA directors, 2 former secretaries of defense, and 2 top Pentagon commanders. What the hell happened here? How damaging is the leak of this kind of classified information? And should a low-level guardsman have been entitled to receive this kind of highly classified information? Bob?
Well, I think first of all, I think the substantive consequences are not as catastrophic as they initially seemed. The positioning of Ukrainian forces is 6 weeks old at this point. Their need for ammunition is well known. That was not a secret. The fact that their air defenses are stressed is not a secret. So I would say that there are two real longer-term consequences of this. The first is a betrayal of trust by the young airmen, but also the betrayal of trust between the United States and our allies and friends, and refreshing their concern whether we can actually keep secrets. The second, and I think the most consequential, is whether these leaks provide the Russians in particular with lead information that will help them identify our American human sources inside the Kremlin, inside the Russian military, inside the Russian intelligence services, which will cost those sources their lives, and it will cost us their information, which has allowed us to be in front of this from the very beginning. Being able to tell the Europeans, the Russians are going to attack, here's what they're going to do, and so on. So that, I think, the compromise of our sources, the compromise of our technical sources, signals intelligence, and so on, I think those are the potentially longer-lasting consequences of this leak. We've been down this path before with WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning in 2010, with Edward Snowden in 2013. It does raise the question in the minds of our allies, can these guys keep a secret? The only good news is they're all penetrated too, so they know they have their own security problems. So they're not exactly going to stand up and castigate us too much. I think that the consequences for our alliances are minimal. They need our information. They know they rely on our information. We get some information from them for sure, but we are the primary provider. So I would say, and the final thing I would say beyond that is the systems that we put in place after Manning and after Snowden clearly have not been effectively implemented. People are not being monitored the way that they should. People are not being investigated the way they should. And so I think, and I think this was kind of a aspect of my time at the Pentagon, people need to be held accountable. And it's not a sergeant, it's not a captain, it's somebody further up the chain of command. Why were these rules that we put in place years and years ago not effectively implemented and enforced? And so I think accountability will be a very important part of this. But I think, just in sum, I think the biggest, longest term risk is to our sources and methods. I think that the substantive damage is not particularly dangerous. There is a undermining of trust on the part of our allies, but they need us as much as we need them.
David? Jim?
I'll just add to what Secretary Gates said, should say in this instance, Director Gates, CIA, I think tapping that zone of experience. 2 points. One is I was Supreme Allied Commander when Chelsea Manning dropped, listen for this number, 350,000 cables. So what has just been leaked is 100 or so. So as Secretary Gates said, we've seen this movie before. 350,000 very embarrassing cables, couple of tough conversations. 3 months later, we moved on. And I think that is how this one will play out. And second point, here in the United States, the question is, how did this happen and what should we do about it? And I'll give you 3 things. Number one, I think extreme accountability. Secretary Gates is right. It ought to be from the top down to the airmen. I believe the airmen should face significant incarceration because that's a deterrent to this happening again. Number 2, revisit of security clearance times. Currently, you get a top secret clearance, no one looks at you for 5 years. That's okay if it's General Petraeus or Admiral Stavridis. If it's Airman Doofus, how about every year we take a look at him or her and we look at the social media accounts, and that's point 3. We got to widen the scan and look in these social media accounts. None of that was salient 2010, 2013. That's a decade ago. In cyber years, that's a century. We got to get on top of this. I'd simply add that to what the Secretary said.
Leon, let me ask just one more thing.
Ahead.
There's a lot of emphasis on the youth of this airman. The truth is, in the cyber internet world, as everybody over the age of, let's say, 40 or so in the audience, these are the people who actually know how to make this stuff work, okay? We all know that. So the truth is, we are going to need to recruit young people into the military who have these technical skills. So it's not the youth of this young man that I think we ought to sort of focus on, but all the things that Jim was talking about and the vetting process and the reinvestigation and the frequency and so on. Because the truth of the matter is, we're going to need a lot of these young people in our services to deal with cyber challenges.
Can I just, one final thought. We just created a Space Force, smart move, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, we have a Space Force. It's time to be thinking about a cyber force, to the Secretary's point.
Okay, let's turn to the theme here, which is democracy versus autocracy. The President described that the primary conflict in the 21st century is the conflict between democracies and autocracies. So he's defined the conflict. But I'm not sure he's defined is the strategy for how we deal with Russia, with China, with North Korea, with Iran, with others. The Council on Foreign Relations did an assessment and came to the conclusion that the United States could very well be in a major military confrontation with either Russia or China as our primary concerns. So let me ask you, what should be the United States strategy to try to prevail over these tyrants that we're dealing with? Should it be containment? We obviously had a policy of containment in dealing with the Soviet Union. Should it be deterrence? Should it be creating an alliance or alliances? All of the above. What should be the primary strategy for confronting these key enemies?
Well, having taught economics at one point in my life, I remember that you can never go wrong by beginning an answer by saying it depends. But in this case, it does depend. It depends on the particular potential adversary or real adversary. Obviously, with respect to China, what we want to do very much is to ensure that what our National Security Advisor describes as severe competition doesn't break down and become severe confrontation. In that case, we have to have a whole of governments with an S on the end, all of our allies and partners together, comprehensive approach to China to ensure that the two elements of deterrence are very solid. And those elements are the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. So with respect to China, it's about deterrence and making sure that those elements are very strong. It should be much, much more than just our military capabilities. It should be all of the above. There's a trade component, sadly, that is missing. Trans-Pacific Partnership was a missed opportunity. But again, that's the approach there. And by and large, I generally think that that's how we are going about that. With respect to Russia, it is to do everything humanly possible to help Ukraine convince Putin that he is wrong when he thinks that he can outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans. We've done really quite an admirable job in providing extraordinary amount of military and economic and humanitarian assistance and leading the world effort in that regard, and also in pursuing economic, financial, and personal sanctions and export controls. There's a number of cases where we could have made decisions a bit sooner, in my view, U.S. tanks, better or longer range precision munitions, and some others. But by and large, we've done, I think, a very impressive job, but we need to keep that up. And we need to tighten the screws, again, on the sanctions and export controls. We need to provide everything possible so that this Ukrainian offensive this summer will succeed, and again, convince Putin that this war is not sustainable, either on the battlefield or on the home front. With respect to there still is a war against Islamist extremists. They are still present, as we all know very much, in Syria, in Iraq, much reduced numbers, but still there. And if you take your eye off them, we have learned the hard way that if you take eye and pressure off them, they can reconstitute and become the Islamic State and a caliphate before you know it. So we need to keep an eye on them in Syria, Iraq, Eastern Africa, North Africa, other places around the world. That is still very much out there. Korea, that's more of a deterrent situation at this point in time, I think. We have tried every possible way to get them to negotiate their nuclear weapons away. They're not going to give them up. So what we need to do there is dissuade him from ever using them and being ready to employ ours if it ever came to that. So again, I think, Leon, you've got to walk your way around the world and take that kind of approach. What I think is unique about these times, and you alluded to this up front, is if you think of the United States as the guy in the circus who has to get a plate on a stick spinning, and then we have a whole tent full of them. Allies and partners help us keep a number of those spinning. I think there's more plates in that tent right now, and they're more challenging than at any time, again, since the end of World War II. So the real challenge is, how do we pursue our national interests against a number of threats simultaneously, together with allies and partners wherever that is possible, and do it all in a way that is as effective and efficient and so forth as is absolutely possible. And that is the challenge of the day. Certainly our values, democracy, free markets, and the rest of that are very near and dear to us. I believe very strongly, along with Churchill, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And we should, without question, promote those. But there are going to be times where we're going to have to work with partners and allies who may or may not embrace all of our approach to these. against worse individuals or worse countries. And I think that has to be probably paramount, is the question of what are our national interests first and foremost. Certainly values and so forth are a big part of that, but they're not the only part of it. And I think it's important to keep that in perspective.
Jim, you were a Supreme Commander for NATO, and we've all been there. We've all did the talking points, and we all walked out and thought, not much is going to happen. Were you surprised that NATO was able to unify as strongly as they did with the United States on this issue? And can we build those kinds of alliances elsewhere?
No, I was not surprised. I think it's popular to kind of denigrate NATO. Oh, those Europeans, they don't spend anything. Let's do the numbers for a minute, okay? So the U.S. spends about $800 billion a year on defense. China spends about $300 billion a year on defense. Russia, our really scary opponent, about $60 billion. How about those, quote, freeloading, end quote, Europeans? What do they spend? They spend $300 billion a year on defense collectively. The Europeans spend more than Russia and China combined. So first and foremost, they spend a lot of money on defense. Second point, they came with us to Afghanistan, fought with us, and died in Afghanistan in numbers. I lost 1,700 killed in action under my command as Supreme Allied Commander in NATO. It's a NATO mission. Of those 1,700 in my 4 years, 600 were Europeans. They gave blood and treasure. Third, to your question, they watch Russia and they see old ghosts rattling. They remember there are elders in those societies that watched the Red Army rape its way across Germany at the end of the Second World War. There are elders in those societies who watched in 1956 when the Red Army crushed Budapest. 68, the end of the Prague Spring. They have seen tanks roll to the east. No, I'm not surprised. A, because the Europeans have the capability. B, because they have shown they will stand and fight when the time comes. And C, because there are old historical imperatives that drive them toward us now.
Can I add something very quickly? Because I think the ultimate irony of this particular conflict is that Putin set out to make Russia great again, of course. But what he's really done is make NATO great again.
Absolutely. Bob, I mean, you've been working on strategy at that level for a long time. What concerns you about the United States' capability to be able to deal with these threats we talked about?
I think right now, Leon, the biggest challenge that we face with our allies and friends and even our adversaries was Trump a one-off or is Biden a one-off? What is the predictability long-term of America? Will the Americans be here for us over the decades, or do we have to hedge our bets? And the reality is, most of the countries in the world are hedging. All the countries in the Middle East are hedging. There have been more visits by the leaders of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to Moscow in the last 2 years than to Washington. Even our allies, and really this kind of underpins some of what Macron is saying, the European has to have some autonomy. And in part, it's because they don't know whether the next president will embrace Article 5 or disparage it. Article 5 being our commitment to come to the assistance of our allies. So I think the biggest challenge right now that the United States faces around the world is, can we be counted on? You know, trust among nations is a lot like trust between individuals. It takes a long time to build it, and it can evaporate in a heartbeat. And they don't know whether to trust us. And it's going to take some time for them to regain confidence. And I'm talking now about our NATO allies, about whether in 2025 we will have a president who says NATO is irrelevant. We don't want anything to do with NATO. Maybe we'll just quit NATO. Or are we going to be there? And the same thing with Japan. I mean, I would like to think that Japan is with us, and they are investing in their military, hugely increasing their investment in their military vis-a-vis China. Partly it is the United States going to be here if we have a problem with China? So I guess I would say, Leon, I think that the biggest challenge that the United States faces now is restoring a sense of predictability and reliability of the United States among our friends and allies, but also among our adversaries. Will the Americans stick to it? And it goes back to a point that both Jim and David made earlier about Ukraine. Putin believes that we won't stick it out. They think that, you know, come 2024, we'll decide, well, we've had enough, it's a stalemate, let them figure it out, and we're tired of spending. And so I think that's the biggest challenge that we face in national security foreign policy at this point. How do we restore a long-term sense of reliability and predictability that our allies and friends and our adversaries can count on?
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. You know, obviously, I think all of us really felt that the Ukrainians fought like hell. We're courageous, we're brave, and we're able to stop the Russian invasion. And Putin then literally engaged in a war of terror on Ukraine, killing innocent men, women, and children, destroying the country, and yet they kept fighting. And now we're at a pivotal time here where everybody is looking to the spring and whether or not Ukraine will initiate a strong offensive, whether the Russians will try to initiate an offensive, because a lot will depend on that. So how is this going to end? Or is it going to end? I mean, some of the intelligence that came out said it's likely we're going to have a protracted stalemate in Ukraine. Can Ukraine put together an effective offensive that pushes the Russians out of the Donbass and ultimately forces Putin either to withdraw or to negotiate?
I think that is possible. Again, there's a degree of uncertainty here. I'm not as pessimistic as some of the assessments that we read in some of these. Now, these are weeks old and so forth. I do think that the Ukrainians this summer will demonstrate a capability we literally have not seen in the war so far, either from the Russians or from the Ukrainians. They got it a little bit last year. And this is the combined arms effects. In other words, where you don't just run tanks down the road by themselves and they get hit by the enemy infantry with anti-tank guided missiles in the wood line. You actually have infantry out there on their flanks, and they're in infantry fighting vehicles now provided by the West. You have artillery and mortars keeping their heads down, suppressed. You have air defense keeping their air off you. You have engineers and EOD to reduce obstacles and defuse explosives. You have logistics right up behind the front lines with additional ammunition, food, fuel, water, medical supply, medical support. You have electronic warfare jamming the enemy's command and control. Your command and control is orchestrating all this. You can see it's very, very complex. We achieved this during the fight to Baghdad when I was a two-star General Division Commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division. It's terrifying to the enemy when this gets going. This is the essence of the thunder runs that the 3rd Infantry Division did so incredibly well and literally just forced the toppling of the regime. I think we will see that this summer. Now, the Ukrainians did a little bit of that last year in the fall in the Eastern Offensive, but they just they culminated after about 72 hours, just physically you run out of ability, and they didn't have the final element of this combined arms effects, which is follow-on forces. So that when the front lines, when they've done all that they can and they culminate, that you have forces that can exploit what they have achieved and push through to a forward passage of lines and continue the attack. And you keep doing that. And then these back here are reconstituted and you keep pushing them. I think they actually will do that in the summer offensive or late spring offensive. As soon as the ground is dry, you can get not just tanks with their treads across it, but ideally even wheeled vehicles without being mired. And so that's a number of weeks at least from now. They keep in mind that the Ukrainian forces that will conduct this operation are not on the front lines. They're not the ones who have denied the Russians the achievement of their winter offensive objectives, which they have not achieved, just like they didn't achieve the toppling of the government, control of Kyiv, and replacement of Zelensky by a pro-Russian figure. The Battle of Kharkiv, the second largest, and a number of others that they lost last year. These forces are being trained at U.S. training centers in Germany, in Poland, in the U.K., and in Ukraine proper. And now what they've got to do over the course of the next month, month and a half or so, is position these and set the conditions so that all of this can unfold and be orchestrated very effectively. And then penetrate these forces, ideally take away the Russian ability to resupply, to link to Crimea, along the southeast coastline of Ukraine from Russia proper, and again, deny that land corridor. And if you can do that, I think, over time, but it's not going to be enough this year. This is going to be a protracted war. We need to plan for that. And by the way, that should drive decisions that we've been, again, reluctant to make, which would be providing the even longer range precision munitions, the Army Tactical Missile System, ATACMS, 300 kilometers vice the current 150 kilometers. We need to start them down the road toward Western aircraft. There are no more MiG-29s in Europe to provide to Ukraine. The last ones have just been provided from Poland and Slovakia. So we need to think that way. But I think we should expect to see a reasonable degree of success this spring and summer. And the question is, will the Russian forces crumble just locally in the face of this kind of offensive, or might they crumble more broadly? If it's more broadly, and they've got a wealth of challenges when it comes to morale, they have terrible logistics, their command and control, their commanders just sacrifice them in these basically human wave attacks. They're raising another 200, 300,000 mobilized forces. They won't be well trained, well equipped. They've lost over half their entire tank force already, and they can't replace that at all in the short term. So that's what I think we have to look forward to, Leon. But I can't tell you, when do you reach the point where Putin might actually be willing to negotiate seriously, and where Ukraine, by the way, with the promise of not just an end to the war on their soil and the casualties, civilian as well as military, but also could look forward to a Marshall-like reconstruction plan and a security guarantee, either membership in NATO, which I believe they should be allowed to pursue, or a U.S.-led security guarantee.
Jim, I'd be interested in your thoughts. Are we looking at finally ending this war or not?
Yes, it will end, and there are two burn rates occurring here. On one side, Putin's burn rate is terrible. He's burning through troops, 200,000. He's probably lost half of his tanks and armor. He is burning through resources. Over here, the burn rate is different. Zelensky's burn rate is our patience. How long do we want to fund this conflict? I think those two burn rates are moving fast, and I think they will cross probably in the, I'd say, 8 to 12 month period. In other words, Putin will realize General Petraeus's point that there's no way out for him. Zelensky will hear quietly, off camera, from the West, enough's enough, negotiate. I think those two things come together 8 to 12 months from now. And so the question, how does it end? I'll give you the answer in 3 words. I don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. War is unpredictable. But I do believe this. Ukraine, our job is to give the Ukrainians the tools they need so they can have the strongest possible position at the negotiating table. If you put a gun to my, thank you. And if you put a gun to my head and said, okay, Stavridis, but how does it actually end? I would say Russia, everyone will hate this, Russia will probably end up in possession of Crimea, perhaps a bit of a land bridge to Russia, and everyone hates that outcome, except for it is the door to Ukraine's reconstruction, the general's point, and their entry into NATO, the security guarantee. If you want a historical example, Google 1939 Winter War, Finland. You'll see that Finland was invaded in 1939 by the Red Army. The Finns fought them to a standstill. They negotiated. They gave up 10% of their territory. They remained an independent nation. Here's the punchline. Finland is a member of NATO today.
Bob, is there a light at the end of this tunnel?
Well, I guess I'm going to be a little bit the skunk at the party. Only because of this. This has become now for Putin an existential conflict. If he loses, he dies. He cannot lose. The one exit ramp he had was to negotiate, as David and Jim were talking about, some retaining control of some portion of those 4 provinces in the Donbass. But he's now made those part of Mother Russia. That's now Russian soil. So if he gives up in a negotiation any part of those provinces, his critics will say, you are giving up part of Mother Russia. And that makes it very, very difficult for him to negotiate. And I mean, I think that the most likely outcome is one in which the Ukrainians make some advances along the lines that David described, and then are halted. The Russians have put in some pretty extraordinary defenses in eastern Ukraine over the winter. Tank defenses and so on, and mines, lots of mines and so on. If I had to bet, it's a long way from my preferred outcome, but I think the most likely outcome at this point is the Ukrainians making advances but ending up with something of a frozen conflict. Very much along the lines at a different geographic point as where they were in 2014. And with the kind of continuing episodic conflict that we saw between 2014 and 2022. Now, it may be that under those circumstances, there's enough pressure in Russia, there's enough pressure in Europe and in the United States to try and figure out some kind of a negotiated outcome. But it won't be a peace, and in my view. And that's the point at which I think I would pick up on the admiral's and the general's point. That's the point at which I think the West makes certain security guarantees to Ukraine that makes clear to Putin and to the Russians, no matter how long they fight, no matter what they bring to the battle, the United States and NATO will not allow Ukraine to be taken over by Russia. And that may be the best outcome that we and Ukraine can get, and it creates an environment in which Ukraine can begin to rebuild.
David?
Yeah, I think two quick points. One is that we have to remember the dynamic inside Russia. And if we can ratchet these sanctions and export controls down farther, they're now running a considerable deficit. That was not the case at the outset with the price of Brent crude going up as high as it did. That might provide a bit more incentive for Putin finally to negotiate. And again, I don't know where the geography is at that point, but I think that could give some incentive as well. The second is that actually hearing of the two clocks, if you will, Jim, I must say reminded me of an episode during the surge in Iraq where Secretary Gates had come out to visit. And I said, you know, Mr. Secretary, there's two clocks in play here. There's the Washington clock and the Baghdad clock. And that Washington clock is ticking a lot faster than the Baghdad clock right now. Thankfully, we ultimately sped up the Baghdad clock, and ultimately the surge succeeded.
I've got three people here involved in the intelligence business. What happened with the intelligence on the Russians? The Russian intelligence and the U.S. intelligence basically said it'll take a few days, they'll take Kyiv, the government will fall within a few days, this thing is over. We saw what happened, we saw the problems the Russians had. How did we miss that in terms of the intelligence on the strength of the Russians?
So as an old intelligence guy, I'm going to grab this one. In my day in intelligence, we divided everything we wanted to know into two categories: secrets and mysteries. Secrets were things that were knowable and stealable. Mysteries were those things that were unpredictable and where nobody knew the answer, including the protagonist. We can always, and CIA forever, has done an amazing job of describing the the deployments and capabilities of foreign military forces. We've done that for decades. We've been on the nose all the time. I will give you two failures that fall into the category that Leon was describing. One was Czechoslovakia in 1968. That happened my first week on duty in CIA. I asked one of my colleagues, my desk mates, I said, is it always that exciting around here? And CIA clearly outlined the number of forces around Czechoslovakia, but predicted the Russians wouldn't go in because of the consequences. They were wrong. Same thing, fall of 1979, described 60, 70, 80,000 Soviet troops on the northern border of Afghanistan. Will they go in? Won't they go in? CIA outlined all the reasons why they wouldn't go in, which were in fact all the reasons they failed. And they went in anyway, because their leadership made an irrational decision. The one thing we cannot predict is will and leadership. One of these guys earlier today talked about how for 2.5 years, Zelensky was kind of an average leader of Ukraine. And then all of a sudden, he becomes Churchillian. Who the hell predicted that? And so the question, I mean, who would have predicted the Brits in the Battle of Britain, standing alone? Who would have predicted the collapse or the many failures of the Russian army? And who would have predicted the courage of the Ukrainians? And the truth is, there are no sources who can tell you that, because they don't know themselves until they're in the middle of it. And people just stand up and say, by God, I'm going to fight for my country. And nobody ever predicted that. So, you know, the Congress has got to have their investigations and, you know, why is this intelligence failure and so on and so forth? Because it's very difficult to predict human behavior. And it's often unpredictable. And people can be so much worse than you predict, and they can be so much better. And anybody who tells you they can figure that out, they should get a lot of money.
Okay.
Or be called out for the fraud they are.
All right, I'd like to take, we're at the midway point here. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our question review team. These are the people who are responsible for selecting the questions that will be presented to our speakers. Please hold your applause until I introduce the entire group. We have Mike Clancy, who's a contributor with the Pacific Grove Press, Dave Kellogg, who's the managing editor of the Monterey Herald, Ray Mashieki, who is a reporter with the Monterey County Weekly, and Doug McKnight, who's a reporter with KAZU Radio. If you would thank them, I'd appreciate it. Sylvia and I also want to thank the Panetta Institute's Board of Directors and the lecture series sponsors that make these programs possible and allow us to share these important discussions with all of you, our audience watching at home, and with the students from across the Central and Northern California. We had a wonderful turnout of students this afternoon. They asked great questions, and it was a great opportunity for them to be able to participate. So if you would please give our sponsors a hand, I would appreciate it. All right, let's go to the questions. If China invades Taiwan, and if China invades Taiwan, should the U.S. go to war with China? And if so, what would that war look like, and can we win it? Anybody want?
This is a maritime theater.
I think, as Secretary Gates said earlier today, I think it depends how it starts. If it is a completely unprovoked Chinese invasion, I think in that case the United States probably will intervene. If it is something that is the result of the Taiwanese themselves declaring independence and trying to flip the table and start a war, then I think it's a harder decision. So the short answer is it depends. The real question is, what should we be doing now that would prevent China from making a decision to attack Taiwan? And an image that I've used before, others have used it as well, is we need to make Taiwan into a porcupine. Make it really hard, prickly, difficult, because lions don't like to attack porcupines. It doesn't go well for the lions. And the way you do that is you take the lessons from what we're watching right now in Ukraine, give them air defense now, give them better jets now, give them better smart minefields to go in the water now, give them better cyber security, give them special forces training, et cetera, not because the Taiwanese are going to attack China, but because that will create real deterrence. Second part of the question, what would it look like? We don't have to guess. China has shown us the battle plan. When Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, China lashed out and effectively showed us in real time what it will look like. It'll be a blockade completely around the island. That'll be an interesting move, because how does the U.S. respond to a blockade short of an invasion? There'll be a blockade. There'll be ballistic missile launches going after critical command and control nodes. There'll be special forces operating on the island who have been implanted for decades. There'll be cyber attacks. There'll be a fleet that'll stand off but be prepared to attack. There'll be a huge air campaign, fighters, long-range bombers. We know what it's going to look like. It'll be a very hard fight. And if the United States decides to intervene, we will lose 1, 2, maybe 3 aircraft carriers. We will lose thousands of sailors. We will run out of precision-guided munitions. However, we have a lot of capability. We can swing into the fight. It'll be unpredictable. I wouldn't bet against us. I'll close with this. If you told me, Admiral, you can have the Chinese fleet or the American fleet to fight this battle, I'd take our hand of cards.
Good. Secretary Gates, in an opinion piece, you wrote the U.S. needs to do a better job of countering disinformation by other nations and spreading a positive U.S. message. What do you believe that message should be?
Well, I think, first of all, and it goes back to actually one of the very first questions you asked, Leon, I think framing this, as the President has done, as a conflict or a contest between democracy and authoritarianism oversimplifies. The reality is, in this contest with China in particular, we're actually going to need the help of a number of countries that are not democracies, that are not full-fledged democracies, that have problematic human rights records. But the question is, and I think where we gain allies in the global south in particular, and countries like India and Indonesia and others, is, are you for a rules-based international environment, or do you want an environment where might makes right, where a powerful country can conquer a neighboring country and nobody cares? Or do you want an international system where people behave according to a certain set of rules, and frankly, many of the rules that we helped establish in the post-World War II environment? The reason George H.W. Bush went to war with Iraq in 1991 was he did not want the first international aggression after the end of the Cold War to be one country conquering another in a triumph of might makes right. And it seems to me that's where we can gain the most international support. We have to operate on two levels: a realistic national interest level, which is what I just described. We also have to operate, as I told one of the young students this afternoon, at an ideological level. We have these values, we have these beliefs. You may not embrace them, but if you're our ally, we will work with you. But we will also work with you to try and move you in the direction of the values that we hold dearest. And I think the other piece of this is we have to be honest about our own shortcomings. And this is not, and this, I have a real problem with sort of national self-flagellation. The thing that I think makes the United States unique in the history of the world is that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution set forth a body of aspirations of who we wanted to be as a country, knowing even then that we fell short of our aspirations. But we are unique in the history of the world in spending 2.5 centuries trying to figure out how to be better, how to get closer to the fulfillment of our aspirations. And I think it's that kind of an honest approach with the rest of the world that says, yeah, we know we've got problems, we know we've got faults, but by God, who do you know in the world that's trying harder and has tried harder for longer to achieve those objectives and those aspirations than we have? And do you want to be with us, or do you want to be with those other guys? So I think we have an appeal on two levels, and I think we can make it work on both.
Okay. Jim, how significant is Finland's recent entry into NATO, and what will it mean for Russia?
It's hugely important. Let me just give you a sense of this, the Finns and the Swedes, and we need to think of them together. They'll both come into the alliance. Finland is already formally in. Swedes will come in probably right after the Turkish elections in May. These are two turnkey militaries. I commanded these troops. They were under NATO command in Afghanistan, in Libya, in the Balkans. I know their qualities. In fact, I'll tell you a story. The Swedes, when I was coming to Afghanistan, at one point said, "We want to be the security detail for the Supreme Allied Commander." And I thought, well, you know, I'm pretty happy with those Navy SEALs and those Green Berets. But they were insistent, and I thought, well, you know, we'll do this for the team. And Stan McChrystal was in command at the time in Afghanistan working for me. And so the Swedish security detail showed up when we landed at Kabul airport. And I think knowing that the admiral is like 5 feet, 5 inches tall on a good day, here comes my Swedish security detail. They're all like 6'5". And I get to the bottom of the ramp and they surround me. And my team is coming down and they can't see me. It's like, where's the admiral? We lost the admiral. They are very capable, and seriously, they build and fly the Gripen fighter. It's as good as our Hornets, our F-18s. I've flown in a Gripen. They can do things a Hornet wouldn't dare do. They're highly capable. That's the Swedes. Here's the Finns, Mr. Secretary. The Finns, a nation of 5 million people, can put 250,000 troops in the field, equipped, trained, highly motivated, in 120 days. They share that capability with only 2 other countries, Switzerland and Israel. It's because they have universal conscription. Everyone has their own equipment, has their gear. They're forced back to retrain every year. They are unbelievably capable. They have a long, bad history with Russia. They have an 800-mile border with Russia, which Putin now has to defend. That distant boom you hear is Putin's head exploding with frustration about the entry of the Finns and the Swedes right behind them. It's enormously important.
Great. David, if North Korea demonstrates a credible capability to strike the continental United States with a nuclear weapon, what should we do?
Well, we should make sure that deterrence is exceedingly strong and they don't even think twice about it. You can argue that they may have that capability now, at least with a liquid-fueled. You know, it's not very accurate, but I think they have shown that they have the ability to reach the continental United States. Beyond that, you know, there's other parts of the United States we care about that are a lot closer. Hawaii, Alaska, Guam. And so there's no question that North Korea now has the ability to deliver nuclear weapons to parts of the United States. And there's also no question, I think, that we have the ability to deter them from doing that because of the enormous capability that we have, frankly, to destroy them if they would ever do that. And we have to make that very clear. But just as we have to make sure, by the way, that our conventional capability is never in question either. And that's why we still have 28,000 U.S. men and women in uniform on the Korean Peninsula.
Bob, let me ask you the question with regards to Iran. If Iran moves forward to develop a nuclear weapon, obviously Israel's made clear that they're not going to allow them to do that. What should the United States do in that situation?
Well, I think that the problem with attacking the Iranian nuclear capability, and I told President Bush this as early as 2007, 2008, is that particularly given how much of the program even then was deep underground, you, at the risk of a full-scale war in the Middle East, you buy yourself 2 or 3 years. You can't unlearn what they have learned. And so an attack on Iran's nuclear capability, whether it's us or the Israelis or anybody else, is only going to force them to go deeper underground and more covert, and to determine them to expand, mature and expand their nuclear capability. My own view is the only way to deal with the Iranian nuclear capability is diplomatically. I think that the agreement that was negotiated by President Obama had a lot of flaws, but I think at the same time, so I actually was opposed to the agreement President Obama signed, but then I thought it was a mistake for President Trump to get rid of it, because we didn't have anything better to put in its place. My biggest worry is that the Israelis attack and are unable to complete the job, and then they look to us to sort of finish it off. So my view has been now for a dozen or more years, 15 years, a military attack on the Iranian capability, first of all, absent the use of nuclear weapons, there is no assurance it will work, given the depth of how deep underground much of their program is at this point. You can set them back because you'll wipe out all the surface structures and so on. But even if you used our most sophisticated deep ordnance penetrators and so on, I think there's a real question whether how much damage you really do, and then what do you set in motion. The concern on the other side of the coin that I have, and I mean this is one of the great dilemmas of dealing with Iran, is if Iran develops and deploys a nuclear weapon, then I think there is a strong motivation on the part of the Saudis, the UAE, potentially the Turks, and maybe others, that if Iran is going to have a usable nuclear weapon, they've got to have one too. So then we have a huge proliferation problem in the Middle East, and with no assurances of the kind of safeguards that we and the Soviets, for example, have had in place on our nuclear weapons. So this is one of the toughest problems in foreign policy, in my view, because there is no assurance that a non-nuclear military attack will be successful in destroying their program. It only buys you a limited amount of time. But then how do you prevent a proliferation problem in the Middle East? And in all honesty, I mean, this is one of those cases where I think people have to be honest and say, I'm not sure what the right answer is here. I'm not sure how we work our way through this. And if David or Jim have a great idea, I'm all ears.
Well, there is an additional complication, and that is that we have had a declaratory policy that we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And this administration has repeated that several times. So you have the challenge that we saw with the previous administration that had a red line.
I have a sign in my office that says, never miss a good chance to shut up.
Yeah, well.
And I think I would apply it to the administration.
Well, and again, never an administration to leave something left unsaid, as they say. At the end of the day, it has been said, as was the red line about chemical weapons use in Syria. And when that red line was crossed and we didn't take action, I remember I was out in the country in Southeast Asia, and the Prime Minister pulled me aside and he said, General, you know, that red line that turned out not to be a red line has repercussions out here. Remember, come back to deterrence. Deterrence is a function of two elements: the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other. Frankly, I think it is at least arguable that the red line that was not a red line, and then more recently the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way it was conducted, may have been factored into Putin's calculations that he could invade Ukraine without the kind of response that we have seen. So that's yet another wrinkle that exists in this case. And as you recall, Leon, when you were the Secretary of Defense and I was the director of the CIA, the Israelis actually were working pretty hard to try to convince us that they were going to do this, and we knew that they really couldn't do it, as the Secretary has explained, and therefore we should do it. So you have that dynamic at play here as well. This is a very, very complicated one with a lot of implications.
I told more than one president, when it comes to ultimatums and red lines,
don't issue them.
if you're going to cock that pistol, you, by God, better
Right.
be ready to fire it,
Right.
because you get to only do that once.
Yep. Remember, Bashar al-Assad must go? That was another one. And we did not take action to make him go. So again, you can argue the merits or demerits of the policy statement and what it implies. But once you've made that, there are implications if you don't pull the pistol once it's been cocked.
Jim, what went wrong in Afghanistan? We had,
Is this
we had-
vodka?
we had a mission to make sure that Afghanistan would never again be controlled by the Taliban. And today, the Taliban controls what's happening in Afghanistan. What went wrong and who's responsible?
Yeah, I think pretty clearly there's a lot of blame to go around here, and I'll start right here with me, with Dave Petraeus, with many admirals and generals who commanded that mission over the 20 years. We failed to build the right kind of Afghan security forces. We built a mini version of the U.S. Army, and that was not the right model, in my view. Think of it in the terms of the American Revolution, the British Redcoats, this powerful army, and the American Minutemen. We chose to build Redcoats. We built a formal, structured, logistically based, highly disciplined force. It was the wrong force, my view, for the Afghans. We should have built Minutemen. The Taliban were the Minutemen in this. So, first failure, U.S. military didn't train, equip, and organize, my view, the right military. Number two, the Afghans themselves failed. They failed themselves. Ashraf Ghani, the last president of Afghanistan, was a complete failure as a leader in the crunch. Compare him to Zelensky. Zelensky, when we said, we'll give you a ride out of the country, Zelensky said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. Ghani got in a helicopter, took $150 million in cash, and flew out of the country. The Afghan leadership failed. Number three, give credit to the Taliban. They had patience, they had the time, as they like to say. They were the Minutemen. They did not have the support of the population ever, and they do not today, but they were clever, difficult foes, and they beat us. And number four, the political leadership, in my view, failed by getting out of Afghanistan. We say in North Florida, where I'm from, you got to know the difference between quitting and getting beat. We quit, we left. When we left, we had a few thousand troops in Afghanistan. When I commanded that mission, I commanded 150,000 troops in that country. By the time we got down to a steady state, there were 15,000 troops. That's when Donald Trump came into office. We had already withdrawn 90% of those troops. As was mentioned earlier, we have 28,000 troops in South Korea. We have 50,000 troops in Europe. We could have kept 7,000 troops in Afghanistan. The Europeans were willing to provide 10,000 at the end game. We could have stayed. We chose to leave. I think those were all failures. All of us, including me personally, ought to own that. And I'll close with this. Nations are like people. They make mistakes. We made a mistake in Afghanistan, a long mistake. I think that at the end of the day, now we need an honest assessment along the lines of what I just said. draw the lessons, and do better next time.
Bob, earlier today, you made a point that the problem was the failure to execute the decision that was done. Could you kind of go into that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we're all agreed that we should have left some number of troops in Afghanistan, and we could have sustained them for a really protracted period of time. But once the President of the United States makes the decision that we're going to bring out all of our troops, so we start with President Trump in 2021, 20, whenever it was. At that point, in 2020, that we're going to have all of our troops out in May of 21. The Pentagon and the State Department right then, in my view, and this goes to Leon's point about execution, if that's the President's decision, then we have a responsibility to all those Afghans who have helped us over the previous 19 years.
Amen.
And so we begin the process of getting in touch with them. We establish contact information with them so that if the time comes we need to get you out of the country, what number do we call? Where do we find you? How do you find us? Let us give you a couple of numbers that you can call. We keep multiple airfields open, Herat in the west, Kandahar in the south, Mazar-e-Sharif in the north, Bagram, Jalalabad in the east, so that we're not requiring those Afghans who have helped us to bring their U.S. documentation through Taliban lines to get to Bagram. And they're able to get to these airfields near their home. President Ghani would have hated it because it said, well, it betrays a lack of confidence. Well, no kidding. No kidding, pal. Yeah, we have lost confidence in you. And so we should have had in place plans not only for contacting those Afghans who had helped us and their families, and how to get to these airfields so we could have an orderly evacuation of them. Those plans should have been done by the State Department and especially by the Defense Department. I will tell you, the one group, we were talking about this earlier today, the one group that did this effectively was CIA. CIA organized, planned, and got their people out. The people who had helped them, the Afghans. So this could have been done, and you would not have had poor Afghans falling off of airplanes flying out of Bagram. This was a disaster. And it had huge foreign policy, as was mentioned earlier. It had huge foreign policy, national security ramifications around the world, witnessing that kind of disastrous departure from Afghanistan and sort of us abandoning people. So this was a failure of execution par excellence, and in this case, in my view, blaming it on either Trump or on Biden personally is a mistake. They do have some responsibility, and I think the primary responsibility is the decision in the first place to get the hell out of Afghanistan. But that said, the Departments of State and Defense have a lot to answer for in terms of our lack of preparation for this evacuation.
David?
Yeah, and keep in mind I was the commander of the theater in which Afghanistan was the U.S. commander. Then I was the commander on the ground of U.S. and NATO forces, and then, of course, the CI director with a lot of focus out there as well. And in fact, I wrote this in an Atlantic piece a year after we pulled out. Number one, we never even got the inputs right in Afghanistan for 9 years. We invaded in late 2001, toppled the Taliban, eliminated the al-Qaeda sanctuary, missed bin Laden, but we'd accomplished that mission, and we then very quickly changed our focus to Iraq. And by inputs, I mean we didn't get the right overarching big ideas, the right strategy. We didn't have nearly the right level of resources. We didn't have the right preparation of our forces. We didn't have the right organizational architectures, a whole host of other elements that are just the inputs, much less actually achieving outputs as a result of getting those right. We didn't get those right until late 2010, General McChrystal deserves a lot of the credit. I replaced him. We finally got that about halfway through my time. We only kept those right for about 7 months before we started a drawdown. And of course, we announced the drawdown in the same speech in which we announced the buildup, which tells the enemy, you know, this is a contest of wills. This is a contest of wills. In Iraq, I refused to even tell Congress we would draw down when I knew we had to draw down. There were no more forces. They had to go home at the 15-month mark. So again, that is a huge shortcoming. Within the construction of the Afghan army, we made a particularly egregious move. Look, I differ a little bit about, I think we basically did build sort of what you described. We had moderately equipped forces out all around the country doing what they have to do in a situation like this as counterinsurgents, which is to defend critical infrastructure and population areas. And then you had a very good central reserve of about 30,000 Afghan commandos who were very well trained and equipped and would get out there on, we insisted on providing U.S. helicopters. Now, Jim and I and Secretary Gates, I think, prevented that during our time. We insisted on still providing Soviet old, because they could repair those. They were analog, they were easily maintained by them. Then we insisted on providing this fleet of Black Hawks. It required 17,000 Western mechanics to keep this fleet going. And we pulled them out. A lot of people forget, they focus on the 3,500 U.S. troops we pulled out. We pulled out 17,000 that also maintained all the other sophisticated stuff that we'd provided. That's the linchpin to get out there. So again, that is another very significant shortcoming. Beyond that, we lacked actual consistency even within administrations, every single one that presided over the war in Afghanistan, much less from administration to administration. And then ultimately, as we have described, we lost strategic patience. We had a sustainable way forward. A lot of us argued for that. It could have been sustained. Again, sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. We had not lost a soldier in 18 months prior to that terrible suicide bombing at the gate at the international airport at Kabul during the withdrawal. This was very sustainable, and yet we chose to withdraw despite knowing that the chances of this ending happily were not going to be very high.
Okay, let me ask all three of you. We're in the process of wrapping up here. We know what the challenges are that are out there. We know it's a dangerous world. We know the problems that Bob, you've defined with regards to the leadership and the problems in our own country in terms of our democracy. And we know the adversaries that are out there, whether it's Russia or China or North Korea or Iran or terrorism. But if you're looking at the United States in the next 5 or 10 years as to where we're headed, give me a sense of whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going right now. Bob?
So if you want to feel good, read the cover story this week in The Economist magazine.
Right.
Yep.
Because it basically says the American economy is actually booming. And what's more, the distance between our economy and everybody else's in the world is growing. In 1991, we had 25% of global GDP. In 2023, guess what? 25% of global GDP, no matter what China has done. Our growth rates, our population, our demographics, our education level is superior to any other part of the world. These are not what you read about in our newspapers every day. So, the country as a whole, I'm really optimistic about. It's our politicians I'm pessimistic about. And I say that in a thoroughly bipartisan way. But there's one other aspect to it, two other aspects. One is old and one is young. The old one is 3 people up here are basically second-generation Americans. My grandfather went from Pennsylvania, on my mother's side, went from Pennsylvania to Kansas in a covered wagon. And look where we all are and what we've done. But young, I was president of Texas A&M. I interacted with the best young people in the world in our military for almost 5 years. I was national president of the Boy Scouts. And when I look at our young people today, I'm encouraged. I think they're terrific. You know, you read all these terrible things about them and so on, but there's more public service projects going on in universities today than there ever were in my time when I was a student. There is more interest in public service. There is more interest in helping other people. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future of our country. My hope, and I guess the one thing that I would say in conclusion is, one of the great things about Ronald Reagan was he was such an optimist about the future of America. We have too many politicians who are talking down America, they are echoing Xi and Putin's theme that we are in decline. The opposite is true in my view.
Okay, quickly, Jim.
Yeah,
This
well said,
This
Mr.
has got to be real
Secretary.
fast. We've got a
I'm
minute.
going to go very quickly because I have to get to SFO and catch an airplane, so excuse me. I think three things make me optimistic. Secretary Gates said one of them is immigration. In my 7 years as a four-star officer, I visited 100 countries. Everywhere I went to the U.S. Embassy, every embassy had lines around the block of people who want to come here. You think you see that at the Chinese embassy, the Russian embassy, the Iranian embassy?
Jim, we got what, about 1 minute?
Immigration. Number two, it's, in my view, the rise of women. It is the way in which women are stepping up, all that capital coming in, that human capital is critical. And number three, and we've talked about it tonight, it's our alliance systems. And I want to conclude with Secretary Gates's point.
Okay.
Napoleon said,
Make it
a
fast.
leader is a dealer in hope. Be that kind of leader, be that kind of citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's been a great night. We've had three stupendous people speaking about really America and how we remain strong for the future. Thank you all for being here.